Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. This happened a few years ago. I was 23, fresh out of college, and my buddies and I thought it'd be cool to do a camping trip before everyone started getting too busy with jobs and adulting. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Nate, his girlfriend Claire, her cousin Sam, and our friend Jared. We decided to head out to Mendocino National Forest, a little over 3 hours from the Bay Area. It was supposed to be a chill trip, just hiking, campfires, and some cheap whiskey Nate insisted on bringing. None of us were hardcore outdoorsy types, but we weren't completely clueless either. We packed enough supplies, had a map, and Nate even brought bear spray, though we laughed about it at the time. The plan was simple: hike about 6 miles to a secluded campsite by the lake, set up for a couple of nights, and just enjoy being disconnected. The first few hours were perfect. Clear skies, great views, and no cell service to distract us. We cracked jokes, took photos, and stopped to snack by the trail. But somewhere around mile 4, things got weird. It started with Sam. He was the youngest of the group, about 19, and not super experienced in the outdoors. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring into the trees on our right. "You guys see that?" he whispered. We all turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just dense forest, tall pines, and shadows. "See what?" Nate asked, rolling his eyes. Sam hesitated. "I don't know. Thought I saw someone standing there." Claire laughed nervously. "Maybe it's Bigfoot." We all chuckled, but I could see Sam wasn't joking. He kept glancing over his shoulder as we continued. I figured he was just spooked, probably saw a shadow or something, but then about half a mile later, Jared spoke up. "Okay, not to freak anyone out," he said, "but I swear I just saw a dude in the trees back there." "Wait, what?" I stopped, feeling my stomach tighten. "Yeah, like a guy. He was just standing there, kind of half behind a tree, watching us." "Dude, don't mess with us," Nate said, though he didn't sound so sure. "I'm serious, man," Jared insisted. He was wearing a dark hoodie or jacket, looked scruffy. I only saw him for a second, and then he ducked behind the tree. We all stood there for a minute, scanning the woods. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just nothing. "I don't see anything," Claire said, but her voice was shaky. "Maybe we should pick up the pace," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We kept walking, but the vibe had totally shifted. Nobody was laughing or joking anymore. Every little noise, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, made us jump. I started to feel like we were being watched, even though I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. Then, about half a mile from the campsite, we all heard it. A rustling sound coming from the trees to our left. It wasn't an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. It sounded like someone walking parallel to us, just out of sight. "Okay, what the actual hell?" Claire hissed. "Let's keep moving," Nate said firmly. We practically power walked the rest of the way, all of us hyper aware of every sound. When we finally reached the campsite, we all breathed a sigh of relief. It was a small clearing by the lake, surrounded by trees, with a fire pit someone had built from stones. "Let's just set up and chill for a bit," Nate said, trying to lighten the mood. We pitched our tents quickly, all of us sticking close together. Nobody wanted to wander off to collect firewood, so we just used what was nearby. By the time we got the fire going, it was dark, and the woods felt even more ominous. "I'm telling you, I saw someone," Jared said again, poking at the fire with a stick. "Me too," Sam added. "Maybe it's a hiker," Claire suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Yeah, a hiker who follows people and hides in the trees," Jared muttered. "Totally normal." We all sat there in uneasy silence, listening to the crackling fire and the occasional splash of water from the lake. Every now and then, someone would shine their flashlight into the woods, but we didn't see anything. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. None of us admitted we were scared, but I could tell nobody wanted to be the first to fall asleep. Nate and Claire shared one tent, Sam and Jared shared another, and I had my own. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, every little noise outside making my heart race. I told myself it was just animals, that there was no reason to freak out. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. You know how your mind plays tricks on you when you're scared? But no, it wasn't my imagination. The footsteps were real, slow, deliberate, crunching the dry leaves outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then a low scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I wanted to yell, to wake up the others, but I couldn't make myself move. I just lay there, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. The footsteps started again, this time circling the tents. Whoever it was wasn't in a rush. They were taking their time, making sure we knew they were there. I finally managed to whisper, "Nate?" My voice was barely audible. No response. "Nate?" I tried again, louder this time. "What?" I heard him whisper back from his tent. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer right away, but then I heard him whisper to Claire, "Stay here." A second later, his tent zipper started to open. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nate stuck his head out of his tent, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. "You're trespassing," he said, trying to sound tough. "We're armed." That was a lie, of course. All we had was his stupid bear spray and a couple of pocket knives. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as Nate was about to crawl back into his tent, there was a loud crash, like someone had thrown a rock at a tree. "Okay, what the hell?" he muttered, pulling the tent zipper shut. "Guys, I think we should leave," Jared called out from his tent. "Like, right now. We're not hiking out in the dark," Nate said. "It's probably just some weirdo trying to mess with us. If we stick together, we'll be fine." None of us liked that answer, but he was right about one thing: we couldn't hike out in the middle of the night. The trail was rough enough in daylight, and the last thing we needed was to get lost. Reluctantly, we all settled back into our tents, though I doubt any of us actually slept. Every little noise outside had me gripping my flashlight and holding my breath. But somehow the rest of the night passed without incident. By morning, it almost felt like we'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. We spent most of the next day debating whether to cut the trip short. Claire and Jared wanted to leave, but Nate insisted we stay. "If we leave now, whoever it was wins," he said, like this was some kind of competition. In the end, we decided to stay one more night, but we agreed to stick together and keep the fire burning all night. We spent the day gathering wood, making sure we had plenty to last until morning. That evening, we cooked some hot dogs over the fire, trying to lighten the mood. For a while, it worked. We started joking around again, almost convincing ourselves that we just overreacted the night before. But as the sun started to set, the unease crept back in. We all kept glancing over our shoulders, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "Maybe it was just an animal," Sam said hopefully. "Yeah, an animal with shoes," Jared replied, rolling his eyes. We stayed up late, talking and trying to keep the mood light, but by midnight the exhaustion hit. Despite our earlier plan to keep the fire going, nobody wanted to stay up alone. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents, agreeing to keep our flashlights and bear spray within reach. I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling again, every noise outside making me jump. Around 2 a.m. it happened. A loud thump against my tent. I bolted upright, heart racing. For a second, I thought maybe a branch had fallen, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. Slow, heavy, just outside the tent. "Nate!" I shouted, fumbling for my flashlight. Before he could respond, the tent fabric ripped open and a hand reached inside, grabbing at me. I screamed louder than I ever have in my life, swinging the flashlight wildly at the hand. It was rough and dirty, with long fingers gripping for anything it could reach. I managed to hit it hard enough that the person yanked it back, but the next thing I heard was worse. The distinct shh of a blade being drawn across the nylon of my tent. "Nate, he's got a knife!" I yelled, scrambling backward until my head hit the back of the tent. "Get off him!" I heard Nate shout, followed by the sound of his tent unzipping. The man slashed at my tent again, the blade ripping through the fabric like paper. I could see his outline now, a tall, scruffy figure silhouetted by Nate's flashlight beam. "Hey, back off!" Nate yelled, charging at him with the bear spray. He unleashed it in a wide arc, and the man staggered back, coughing and swearing. "Get to the fire pit," Nate shouted at me. I didn't need to be told twice. I crawled out of the shredded tent and ran toward the center of the campsite, where Claire and Jared were already huddled, clutching their flashlights. Sam was there too, his face pale as a ghost. "Who is he?" Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Nate said, keeping his flashlight trained on the man who was retreating into the shadows. For a moment it seemed like he might leave, but then we heard him laugh, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think that's gonna stop me?" he called out, his voice raspy and uneven. "You think spray is gonna save you? Leave us alone," Nate shouted, though I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. The man didn't respond. Instead, he disappeared into the trees, the darkness swallowing him whole. We stood there in silence, our flashlights darting around the woods, waiting for him to come back. Minutes felt like hours. "Maybe he's gone," Claire whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. "We can't stay here," Jared said. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't hike out in the dark," Nate argued. "He'll pick us off one by one." "So what do we do?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. Nobody had an answer. We decided to build the fire back up, hoping it would keep him away. Nate and Jared stood guard with the bear spray and a hunting knife Jared had brought, while the rest of us gathered as much wood as we could find. For hours, nothing happened. The woods were silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But none of us relaxed. We knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. Around 4 a.m., just when we thought we might make it to sunrise, we heard the sound of footsteps again, this time coming from multiple directions. "Is there more than one?" Claire whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. The footsteps got closer, circling the campsite. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They wanted us to know they were there. "Stay together," Nate said, his voice trembling. Suddenly, a rock flew out of the darkness, landing inches from the fire. Then another, and another. "Stop it," Nate shouted. "We'll call the cops," but they didn't stop. The rocks kept coming, some of them hitting the tents, one even knocking over a lantern. We huddled closer to the fire, our flashlights darting around wildly. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. "I think they're gone," Sam said. But before he could finish, the man from before lunged out of the darkness, swinging his knife. He charged straight at us, his knife gleaming in the firelight. Nate reacted first, spraying the bear spray directly at his face. The man let out an animalistic scream, stumbling backward and clawing at his eyes, but he didn't drop the knife. "Run," Nate yelled, grabbing a burning log from the fire as a weapon. We didn't need to be told twice. Claire grabbed my arm, and we bolted toward the trail, the others right behind us. My legs felt like jelly, but the adrenaline kept me moving. Behind us, I could hear the man's furious screams and the sound of branches snapping as he chased us. The trail was barely visible in the dark, even with our flashlights. I tripped over roots and rocks, almost falling several times. Claire was sobbing, and I could hear Sam gasping for breath, but nobody stopped. "He's still coming!" Jared shouted from the back of the group. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him, stumbling but relentless, his knife still in hand. He was wheezing, his face red and swollen from the bear spray, but it didn't slow him down. "Keep going," Nate yelled. We reached a fork in the trail and hesitated, unsure which way to go. "Left," Nate shouted, taking the lead. We followed, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but the sound of the man's footsteps kept me moving. Suddenly, Sam tripped and fell hard, crying out as he hit the ground. "Help me!" he screamed. Nate and I skidded to a stop and turned back. The man was almost on top of him, his knife raised. Without thinking, Nate swung the burning log at the man, hitting him square in the chest. The man staggered back, his shirt catching fire. He dropped the knife, frantically trying to pat out the flames. I grabbed Sam under the arms and dragged him to his feet. "Go! Go! Go!" Nate shouted. We didn't stop running until we saw the faint glow of the trailhead parking lot through the trees. I've never been so relieved in my life. When we reached the lot, we collapsed against the car, gasping for breath. Claire fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the doors. "Is he still coming?" Jared asked, his voice trembling. I turned and scanned the trail, but there was no sign of him. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound our ragged breathing. We piled into the car and sped off, leaving everything behind. Tents, gear, everything. Nobody spoke on the drive back. We were too shaken to even process what had happened. We reported the incident to the police the next day, but they didn't seem to take us seriously. They said it was probably a drifter or a squatter and assured us that they'd send someone to check the area. I don't know if they ever found him. I still think about that night all the time. I can't sleep in the dark anymore, and I haven't been camping since. Every time I hear footsteps behind me, even in broad daylight, my heart races. The scariest part? He wasn't some supernatural monster or ghost. He was just a man, a real flesh and blood human being, and that makes it so much worse. Camping has always been my way of pressing the reset button on life. It's my escape from the noise of the world, the constant buzz of notifications, the deadlines, and the endless grind. I thought I knew what I was doing. I'd been on dozens of solo trips before, but nothing prepares you for what happens when that sense of peace you're searching for turns into a nightmare. This happened last summer. I'd just wrapped up a brutal quarter at work, and I was completely burned out. I needed to clear my head, so I packed my gear, jumped in my car, and headed out to Lassen National Forest in Northern California. It's a beautiful place, miles of trails winding through dense forest, volcanic landscapes, and pristine lakes. Perfect for getting lost in nature without actually getting lost, if you know what I mean. I got to the trailhead in the early afternoon. It wasn't crowded, just a couple of cars parked there, and I felt that familiar sense of freedom as I started hiking. I didn't plan on going far, just far enough to feel like I was in my own little corner of the world. After about a mile and a half, I found this spot. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with just enough sunlight filtering through to make it feel welcoming. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and spent the evening relaxing. I cooked some dehydrated meal I'd brought, drank a couple of beers, and just sat there watching the sky turn from blue to orange to this deep, inky black. The stars out there are incredible. No city lights to mess with them. It's the kind of view that makes you feel small in the best way. By the time I climbed into my tent, I felt good, really good. The sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, were soothing. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. I lay there for a minute, groggy and disoriented, listening. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human ones. Slow, deliberate crunching on the dry leaves just outside my tent. My heart started racing. I froze, straining to hear. For a second, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the wind. But then I saw the light. A flashlight beam swept across the walls of my tent, casting these weird, distorted shadows. It wasn't just a quick pass. It lingered, moving up and down, side to side, like whoever was holding it was checking the tent out. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was maybe it was another camper, but why would they be wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night? And why weren't they saying anything? I lay there, holding my breath, hoping they'd just move on. But they didn't. The light stopped, aimed directly at my tent. I could see the shadow of a person, the outline of their legs through the thin fabric. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely think straight. I reached for the trekking pole I'd left next to my sleeping bag, gripping it tight. It was the only thing I had that could double as a weapon. Then I heard it. The sound of someone unzipping a jacket, followed by the faint jingle of keys or metal. My stomach twisted. It was such a specific sound, and it told me this person wasn't just passing by. They were preparing to do something. The flashlight clicked off, plunging everything into darkness. That's when I heard the tearing sound, the unmistakable rip of fabric. They were cutting into my tent. Panic took over. Without thinking, I yelled as loud as I could and swung the trekking pole toward the sound. It hit something solid, an arm maybe, or a shoulder, and the person let out this low, guttural grunt. Then they ran. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, the sound fading as they got farther and farther away. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there in the dark, gripping the trekking pole, my ears straining for any sound that might mean they were coming back. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up my gear and got out of there. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack and practically jogged back to the trailhead. I reported it to the park rangers, but they didn't seem overly concerned. One of them said it was probably some drunk hiker messing around. I wanted to believe that, but it didn't sit right with me. Drunk hikers don't carry knives and start slashing tents. I haven't been camping since. I want to go back someday. I miss the peace, the simplicity of being out there. But every time I think about it, I see that flashlight beam and hear the sound of my tent ripping open. And I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't fought back, I might not be here to tell this story. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I'm the type of person who always takes precautions, trusts my gut, and stays aware of my surroundings. But no amount of preparation could have prepared me for what happened that night in Lake Arrowhead, California. I had been living in my RV for about a year at the time. I wasn't doing anything extravagant, just working remotely, traveling around the West Coast, and enjoying the freedom that comes with living on the road. I've stayed in a lot of campgrounds, some more populated and some isolated. I loved the peace of being out in nature, especially when I could park away from other campers. This particular night, I had parked in a quieter spot near the woods, away from the main road. It was late October, so most of the summer tourists had already left, and the campground was almost empty. There were a couple of RVs a little further down, but nothing too close. I had the whole night to myself, and that's exactly how I liked it. Around 9 p.m., I made dinner, sat down to watch a show on my laptop, and settled in. The windows were closed and the inside of the RV was warm, the small lamp on the table casting a soft glow over everything. Everything felt calm and safe. But then around 11 p.m., I heard the knock. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. It was soft, almost tentative, like someone didn't want to disturb the peace too much. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't seen a soul for hours, and this late at night, who would be knocking on my door in the middle of nowhere? I cautiously got up and went to the small peephole in the door, but it was too dark outside to see anything. I could make out shapes moving outside, but nothing specific. I felt that prickling sensation in the back of my neck, the kind you get when something isn't right, but I tried to shake it off. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking a little. A man's voice responded almost immediately. "Hey, sorry to bother you. My car broke down just up the road. Can I use your phone to call for help?" I was confused. There were a few other RVs around, and if his car had really broken down, why hadn't he gone to one of them? It didn't make sense. "Where's your car?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "Just a little ways up the road," he answered. I didn't see anyone else around, and I was hoping I could just use your phone. I didn't buy it. I knew there were at least 2 other RVs not far from me, and there were other campers on the main road. Why come all the way to me, especially at this hour? The more I thought about it, the more something felt wrong. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You should try the other RVs. They might be awake." There was a long pause, too long. I could hear the man shifting outside, his footsteps moving back and forth. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. "Are you sure? I really don't want to be out here much longer. It's freezing, and I could really use a hand." I had the sudden urge to lock the door, to grab something to defend myself, but I didn't want to overreact. I took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry. I'm just trying to relax tonight. Please leave." I thought that would be the end of it, but then the situation turned worse, much worse. I heard him step closer to the door, his voice now lower and more insistent. "You're not being very friendly. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." My heart slammed in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to do something. Anything. I stepped back from the door, keeping my eyes on the handle. I could see the shadow of him through the small window, pacing back and forth. "Listen," I said, trying to sound tougher than I felt. "I've already told you I can't help. Please just go." And then the door handle started rattling. My blood ran cold. He was trying to open it. My RV is old, but I made sure to lock it when I got inside, especially at night. But hearing the handle turn, feeling the slight jolt as he tried to force his way in, it terrified me. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know if I should call the cops or try to confront him. I knew that if he got in, I wouldn't be able to handle him on my own. Before I could make up my mind, there was a loud thud against the door. I jumped back, the sound reverberating through the thin walls of the RV. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't leaving. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was something. I tried to steady my breath, but then the door suddenly flew open. He wasn't just trying to open it, he had forced his way in. He pushed through the door so hard that it slammed into the wall behind it, and there he was standing in front of me. I was frozen for a moment. He was tall, probably around 6'2" or 6'3", wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His face was partially obscured by the hood, but I could make out a couple of tattoos on his neck. His eyes were wide, almost wild. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I swung the flashlight as hard as I could, connecting with his shoulder. He grunted, stumbling back, but didn't fall. He grabbed my wrist with one hand, trying to yank the flashlight away from me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I just knew I had to get away from him. I kicked, trying to break free, but he was stronger. His grip tightened on my arm, and I felt panic rise in my chest. That's when I saw it, a small kitchen knife on the counter, just a few feet away. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, my hand trembling, and with all the force I could muster, I stabbed it toward his chest. I don't know if it hit him, but it was enough to make him pull back. He cursed under his breath and backed toward the door, looking almost surprised that I'd fought back. I wasn't waiting for him to think it over. I slammed the door shut as hard as I could and locked it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, dialing 911. I didn't even know if he was still out there, but I wasn't taking any chances. The cops arrived within 20 minutes, but by then, the man was gone. They found a few footprints in the dirt outside, and they even found a tire iron he must have dropped. But that was it. No sign of him. I ended up leaving that campground the next morning. I didn't feel safe there anymore, and I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe staying alone in an RV again. Every time I think about it, my heart races. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't fought back, if I hadn't grabbed that knife. I don't know if this guy was just some random creep or if he had other plans, but I can tell you one thing. I'll never take my safety for granted again. To anyone out there who camps or travels alone, please be cautious. There's always someone out there watching, waiting for an opportunity, and when that opportunity comes, it's up to you to make sure you're ready. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I needed a break. Life had been too much, work stress, constant noise, and never-ending deadlines. So I packed up my gear, drove a few hours north from Sacramento, and set up camp in a secluded area of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This wasn't my first solo camping trip, but it was by far the most remote I'd ever been. There were no campgrounds, no other campers around, just me and nature. The sky was clear when I set up my tent. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of a bird were the only things I could hear. It felt good to be away from everything. After a small fire to cook a quick meal, I made myself comfortable in the tent, zipped up tight, and tried to read a little before falling asleep. I thought about the quiet, thought about the solitude. Night settled in and the temperature dropped quickly, forcing me to zip my jacket tight around me. I had planned to sleep early, waking up for a hike at dawn. But as the night deepened, I started hearing things. At first, it wasn't much, just a rustle like a small animal in the bushes nearby. I've camped enough to know that sounds like that are normal. It could have been a raccoon or a deer. I tried not to let it bother me, but then the noises started getting closer. I stayed still, trying to focus on the crackling of the fire outside and not the rustling that was growing louder. It was coming from just outside my tent. It wasn't an animal anymore. The noise had a rhythm, like someone was circling the tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself, holding my breath, hoping the noise would go away. But it didn't. The rustling stopped for a moment, but then came a slow, deliberate scraping along the side of the tent. It was almost like someone was running their hand across the fabric, just lightly enough that it barely made a sound. My heart started to race. It could still be an animal, I tried to convince myself. But then the footsteps came. Slow, heavy steps, moving back and forth outside the tent. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or not, but my instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The worst sound, though, was the zipper. At first, it was soft. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but then I heard it again, a faint click of the zipper being pulled. I immediately froze, my mind scrambling. I grabbed my flashlight from the side of the tent, my fingers shaking as I clicked it on. The light flickered for a second and then illuminated the inside of the tent. I didn't dare peek outside. I kept the flashlight aimed at the walls, praying the person, or whatever it was, would just leave. But then the zipper slid down again. This time it was deliberate. It was slow, and it was too quiet. The man, or whoever it was, wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to get in. I held my breath. The flashlight felt like a worthless comfort now. I heard his breathing, low and steady, and then the silhouette of a man appeared in the entrance just outside my tent. I couldn't see his face at first, but I could see his figure through the thin fabric. He was standing there, motionless. I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew he wasn't there for anything good. Panic surged through me. Should I scream? Should I make a run for it? But if I screamed, he might come in faster. And if I ran, I didn't know if I could outrun him in the dark. Then I saw something glinting in his hand. A knife. The reflection of the moonlight off its blade sent a chill through me. I backed up in the tent, my mind racing. I had a small pocket knife, but it felt useless compared to his. I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to come in. My survival instincts kicked in. I reached for the edge of the tent, the flaps still halfway open. I had to get out. I wasn't going to sit there and let him get any closer. I had to act fast. I quickly unzipped the back of the tent, silently, praying the man wouldn't hear. As I crouched low to the ground, I heard his voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but I could make out the words, "You don't need to run." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted into the darkness of the forest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear his footsteps behind me, close but not close enough. My heart was pounding in my chest. My breath ragged and sharp as I pushed through the dense underbrush, blindly running deeper into the woods. I couldn't tell if he was following. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was getting away. I couldn't stop, couldn't let him catch me. I found a tree large enough to hide behind and crouched down, trying to control my breathing. I stayed there, trembling, listening for any sound. The only thing I could hear was my own panicked breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Then silence, complete silence. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too scared to move. I heard nothing, no footsteps, no voice, no movement. I didn't know if he had left or was still waiting, watching for me to make a mistake. The first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I had to get out of there. I waited just a little longer, too afraid to move until the sun was up enough to offer some safety. I eventually made my way to the nearest ranger station. I was shaking, my legs weak, my mind spinning with disbelief. The rangers were kind but concerned. They listened carefully to my story, their expressions serious. They sent a team to check the area. When they came back, the rangers were grim. They found signs of someone having been in the area all night, footprints around my tent, broken branches, and evidence that whoever had been stalking me had been watching for hours. But the man was gone. They couldn't track him down. The only thing they could do was offer to escort me back to my car. I've never been able to forget that night. The terror of hearing that man's breath just outside my tent, knowing that I was helpless, knowing that he was so close to getting in. I haven't gone camping alone since, and I never will again. I noticed a shadow moving outside my RV as I was preparing dinner. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the flicker of a tree swaying in the wind, or maybe an animal passing through. But then it came back. A shape. It was strange how steady it seemed, moving slowly, deliberately. I had parked my RV at a small, secluded campground near Shasta Lake, California. It was a quiet place, tucked away in the trees, far from the hustle of city life. The place felt peaceful when I arrived earlier that day. It was off-season, so the campground was nearly empty, which was fine by me. I liked the solitude. I was chopping vegetables for a stew when I first saw the shadow. My hands froze for a second, the knife midair. I brushed it off. Probably just a deer, I thought. I kept my eyes on the stove, trying to stay focused. But there it was again, closer this time. The figure wasn't moving like a normal person would, but it was more like it was carefully pacing just outside the window. I could see the silhouette through the thin curtains. I quickly stepped away from the counter, suddenly feeling uneasy. I don't know why, but my first instinct wasn't to call the campground office or grab my phone. It was just a feeling of dread creeping over me, something I couldn't quite explain. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the small kitchen window, trying to get a better look. I squinted into the darkness but couldn't make out any details, just a shape standing outside. It was too still, too silent. I could feel my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Do you need something?" I had no idea who it might be. Maybe someone else staying in the campground. There was no answer, no movement. It just stood there, motionless. I took a deep breath and opened the RV door, telling myself that I was just overthinking it. But the moment the door creaked open, the figure bolted, running into the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped outside, shining the flashlight in the direction they had gone. All I could see were shadows. The air felt thick, oppressive. I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat. I stood there for what seemed like forever, listening to the distant sound of leaves crunching as the person moved deeper into the woods. But they were gone, just like that. I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance out the window, hoping I was just imagining things. It wasn't like me to get so paranoid, but something about that encounter had unsettled me. I kept my RV door locked, double-checked the windows, and even wedged a chair under the handle, just to be safe. But still, I couldn't sleep well. The quiet of the night was suffocating, the silence too thick to ignore. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was soft at first, almost like a tapping. I assumed it was rain or maybe the wind hitting the side of the RV, but as I listened more closely, I realized the tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't coming from the roof, but from the side of the RV, close, as if someone was standing right outside. I felt my blood run cold. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. The tapping continued for a few more seconds before it stopped. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. I could hear the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to get up, to look out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if it was the same person from earlier? The next sound was the worst. Footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Walking around the RV, pacing, just out of sight. It was like they were circling the RV, studying it, watching. I held my breath, straining to hear. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was outside, and they weren't just passing through. I heard something scrape against the side of the RV. It wasn't a branch or an animal. It sounded like a knife or something sharp dragging along the metal. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Whoever it was wasn't just making noise for no reason. They were trying to get my attention. I didn't want to make any noise, but my mind raced. I thought about my options. Should I just stay quiet? Hope they'd go away? What if they were trying to break in? I was in the middle of nowhere, far from help. Then the scraping sound stopped, and I thought maybe it was over. Maybe they left. But then, just as I was starting to breathe easier, I heard a loud crash, glass shattering. I jumped out of bed, my heart leaping into my throat. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and crept to the window. That's when I saw the figure again, closer this time. They were standing at the back of the RV, near the window where I had left the blinds cracked. The person reached down and tried the handle. The RV door was locked, but I knew it wouldn't stop them for long. I could hear them fumbling with the lock, trying to force it open. I could feel panic rising in my chest. I knew I had to do something. My eyes flicked to the corner of the room where I had installed a loud alarm. It was just a precaution, but I never thought I'd need to use it. I grabbed the remote, pressed the panic button, and held my breath. The sound that erupted from the alarm was deafening, a shrill, ear-piercing noise that filled the entire RV. For a second, everything stopped. I heard the person curse, then the sound of their feet pounding against the ground as they ran away. I didn't dare move. I stayed still, listening to the silence that followed. My heart was still racing. and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there watching. Um, uh, I didn't sleep at all that night. I just kept the alarm remote in my hand, waiting for any sign that they'd return. In the morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I didn't report it to the police. I didn't even know who to describe. All I knew was that I wasn't sticking around to find out. To this day, I don't camp alone anymore. Every time I think about that night, I feel a chill. I never found out who that person was or what he wanted, but I don't plan on ever finding out. This happened a couple of years ago when my friends and I decided to go camping in Northern California. I still can't go camping anymore because of it. There were 4 of us, me, my buddy Kyle, and 2 other friends, Mike and Jake. We're all pretty outdoorsy, so we thought it'd be fun to get out of the city for a weekend. Kyle suggested this spot by a river. It was remote, surrounded by trees, and supposed to be super peaceful. We packed up the usual gear: tents, sleeping bags, food, and beer. We even brought a portable grill for the fish we planned to catch. The drive out there took a few hours, and the last stretch was down this narrow dirt road. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon. The place was beautiful. The river was clear enough to see the rocks at the bottom, and the only sounds were the water and the occasional bird. There wasn't another soul in sight. It was exactly what we were looking for: secluded, quiet, and perfect for a weekend getaway. We set up camp about 50 yards from the river, just far enough to stay dry if the water rose. Once everything was set up, we spent the rest of the evening fishing and grilling by the fire. We even managed to catch a few trout, which we cooked for dinner. It was shaping up to be an awesome trip. That night, after a few beers and a lot of laughs, we all crashed in our tents. I remember lying there, listening to the river. It was one of those moments where you're just completely at peace. But that peace didn't last long. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned out, and the only light was the moon reflecting off the river. That's when I heard it, a splashing sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like footsteps in the water. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It sounded like someone was wading through the shallow part of the river. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything, but the sound kept going. I whispered for Kyle, who was in the tent next to mine. He groggily woke up, and I told him what I heard. He brushed it off, saying it was probably nothing, and went back to sleep. I didn't sleep much after that. The splashing stopped after a while, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The next day, I told the others about it. They all teased me, saying I was being paranoid. We spent the day fishing and exploring the area. Everything seemed normal, and by the time the sun set, I started to think maybe they were right. But that night, it happened again. I woke up to the same sound, splashing in the river. This time, it was closer. I could hear the water sloshing like someone was walking toward the bank. My heart was racing. I woke Kyle up again, and this time he stayed awake to listen. When he heard it, his expression changed. He wasn't laughing anymore. We woke up Mike and Jake, and all 4 of us sat in our tents, whispering and listening. The splashing stopped eventually, and we convinced ourselves it was just an animal. But none of us slept well that night. The 3rd night was when everything went to hell. We decided to keep the fire going all night for some light and warmth. We also kept our flashlights and a couple of knives nearby just in case. We tried to stay up late, talking and joking to keep our minds off the weirdness. Around midnight, the splashing started again. But this time, it wasn't in the river, it was on the bank. It sounded like wet footsteps, squishing in the mud, getting closer to our campsite. Kyle grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. At first, we didn't see anything. Then, out of nowhere, a man stepped into the light. He was soaking wet, wearing a hoodie and jeans. His hood was pulled up, and his face was partially in shadow. But what we could see was the glint of knife in his hand. None of us moved. We just froze, staring at him. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching us. Then he started walking toward the fire. Kyle was the first to snap out of it. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it out like a weapon. "Stay back," he yelled. The man stopped for a second, tilting his head like he was thinking. Then he lunged. Everything happened so fast. Kyle swung the burning branch at him and the guy stumbled back, tripping over something on the ground. That gave us just enough time to grab whatever we could, rocks, sticks, anything, to defend ourselves. We all started yelling and throwing things at him. He scrambled to his feet and took off toward the river. We didn't wait to see if he'd come back. We packed up our stuff as fast as we could and got out of there. The drive home was dead silent. None of us could believe what had just happened. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting him to be following us. To this day, I don't know what that guy wanted. Was he planning to rob us? Hurt us? Worse? I'll never know. And honestly, I don't want to. What I do know is that I'll never go camping again. Every time I close my eyes, I see that guy stepping out of the darkness, soaking wet, holding that knife. It's the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. If you're ever out camping, please, just be careful. You never know who or what might be out there. I've always loved camping, and I've done it alone plenty before. It's peaceful, it's freeing. There's something about being out in nature, away from all the noise of daily life, that makes me feel calm. I've camped all over California, from the beaches to the mountains to the dense woods, but I'll never forget the night I went camping near a remote area in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was early fall, the leaves just starting to turn, and I decided to take a trip to get some fresh air. I had my tent, my gear, and I was excited to spend the night out in the wilderness. I chose a spot deep enough in the woods where I knew I wouldn't be bothered. It was a little bit of a hike to get there, but I didn't mind. I was used to walking long distances. That evening, everything was going fine. The weather was perfect. The sky was clear, the temperature was just right. Not too cold, but cool enough that the campfire felt comforting. I got the fire going, roasted a few marshmallows, and just sat there, enjoying the peace. There were no other campers in sight. It was just me and the forest. As night started to fall, I began to feel a little more isolated. That's the thing about being in the wilderness. Even when you're alone, you can't shake the feeling that something's always watching you. But I didn't think much of it. I've been alone in the woods plenty of times before. I was used to the quiet, to the feeling of being small in the vastness of nature. But then something caught my eye. I was sitting by the fire, just staring into the flames when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my eyes were adjusting to the darkness. But when I looked again, I realized there was a figure standing at the edge of my campsite. Not moving, just standing still at the farthest edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat. I could barely make out his shape in the darkness, but there was no mistaking that he was a man. Tall, with a scruffy beard, wearing a jacket and jeans, but no sign of a backpack or camping gear. Just standing there. I tried to brush it off at first. Maybe he was just another hiker passing by. The thought made sense. After all, this was a public campground, even if it was a little remote. But then I realized something. He wasn't moving, he wasn't walking or doing anything. He was just standing there, staring into the woods. It felt like hours had passed, but when I checked the time, only 5 minutes had gone by. 5 minutes of standing completely still, not a single sound. I called out to him, trying to sound casual, trying not to let my voice betray how uncomfortable I was. "Hey, You need something? No response. Not a word. Not even a slight movement. He was still just standing there, like he hadn't even heard me. My stomach twisted. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he couldn't hear me. Maybe he didn't want to talk. But something didn't sit right with me. I decided to try again. "Are you okay?" I asked, a little louder this time. Still, no answer. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, as if he was watching something far beyond my campsite. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Why was he standing there? What was he waiting for? It was like he had no intention of moving, no intention of acknowledging me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward him, hoping the light would break whatever spell he was under. He didn't even react to it. I was starting to feel uneasy. My heart was pounding in my chest. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to overreact, but I also didn't want to ignore the gut feeling telling me something was wrong. I grabbed my camping knife from the side of my bag, just in case. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't keep staring at him. It was too unsettling. So I decided to retreat into my tent, hoping that if I just ignored it, he'd leave. I zipped myself into the tent, trying to calm my nerves. But that's when things started to get worse. From inside the tent, I could still see the dim glow of the campfire flickering outside. And then I heard it, the crunch of leaves. Slowly at first, then louder. Someone was moving toward my tent. My pulse quickened. I was trapped inside. There was nowhere to go. I couldn't just call for help. There was no cell service here. No one would hear me. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind or some animal passing through. But then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate step on the dry leaves, followed by another, and another. I couldn't tell how close he was. It could have been 20 feet or 2. My flashlight was beside me, and I gripped it in my hand, ready to use it if I had to. The sound of footsteps stopped just outside my tent. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I heard a low voice, barely a whisper, but enough for me to hear clearly. "Hey," the man said, "are you alone?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't let him know how scared I was. He didn't say anything else for a moment, but then I heard him moving around the tent, slowly like he was circling it. My eyes darted around, trying to find an escape, but there was nothing. He was blocking the only exit. Then, without warning, I felt a tug on the corner of the tent. He was pulling at it, trying to unzip it. I felt the weight of his hand pressing against the fabric. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it as hard as I could at the corner where I thought his hand was. The metal struck something solid, and I heard a grunt from outside. The tent shook, but I didn't stop. I kept swinging, hitting whatever part of him I could reach. After what felt like an eternity, the pulling stopped. I heard him curse under his breath, and then the sound of footsteps retreating. I didn't dare move for what seemed like forever. I stayed frozen in the tent, listening, waiting for any sign of him coming back. But eventually the night grew quiet again. I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion because I woke up the next morning with the sun rising in the sky. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and hiked out of there, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. I didn't care about the beautiful view or the peace of the wilderness anymore. I was just glad to be leaving. When I got back to my car, I noticed a ranger nearby. I told him what had happened, and he listened carefully, nodding. It turns out there had been reports of a man lurking around that area, targeting solo campers. The ranger said they'd been trying to catch him for weeks. The man was found later that day, hiding in the woods. He was arrested and confessed to targeting lone campers. He said he liked the feeling of control, the thrill of waiting, watching, and finally approaching someone when they were most vulnerable. I don't even know where to start, but this happened a couple of weeks ago when I was camping alone near Big Bear Lake in California. I wasn't planning anything wild. I just wanted some quiet time away from everything. Work stress, noisy neighbors, the whole deal. I figured parking my RV at this quiet campground would be the perfect getaway. I had no idea I'd be fighting for my life. So I got there early on a Friday morning and found this great little spot tucked away near some trees, but not too far from the lake. The campground wasn't full, but there were a few other RVs parked on the other side of the lot, maybe 200 yards away. I liked the space. It felt secluded, but not completely isolated. The first day was great. Hiking, reading, just enjoying the peace and quiet. By nightfall, I was pretty tired, so I locked up everything, double-checked the door to make sure it was secure, and went to bed around 10 p.m. Now here's the thing. I'm a light sleeper, so even the smallest sound can wake me up. That's probably the only reason I'm still alive. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard this faint scraping noise. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal brushing up against the RV. I told myself to ignore it and rolled over, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It sounded like someone trying to jimmy the door open. My stomach dropped. I reached for my phone, but stupid me, I hadn't plugged it in, and the battery was dead. I couldn't even use the flashlight app. My actual flashlight was in the front of the RV, so I was stuck in complete darkness. I tried to stay calm, just listening. The sound of metal against metal was unmistakable now. Someone was messing with the lock. No doubt about it. My RV isn't fancy or anything, but it's solid, and I always keep it locked up tight. Still, I knew if someone was determined enough, they could break in. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to yell something, maybe scare them off, but then I thought, what if it's more than one person? What if yelling just makes it worse? I decided to stay quiet and wait. The noise stopped suddenly, and for a second, I thought maybe whoever it was had given up. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking around the outside of the RV. They stopped near the window by my bed. I swear I could feel someone standing there, staring in, even though the blinds were down. I tried to control my breathing, but my chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, and then I saw the shadow. Through the thin fabric of the blinds, I saw this tall figure standing just outside. They didn't move for what felt like forever. I don't know how I didn't scream. Finally, the figure moved away, and I heard them go back to the door. This time, they weren't trying to be quiet. The door handle jiggled violently, and then came the loudest sound yet, the lock snapping. The door swung open, and I saw this man standing there, backlit by the faint glow of the moon. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say anything, just stepped inside, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I froze. I didn't even have anything to defend myself with except the flashlight up front. I forced myself to move, crawling as quietly as I could toward it. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The man didn't notice me at first. He was looking around, maybe making sure no one else was there. When he finally spotted me, I was halfway to the flashlight. "Don't move," he said, his voice low and steady. But I didn't stop. I lunged for the flashlight and swung it as hard as I could, smashing it into his arm. He let out a yell and stumbled back, but instead of running, he reached for something in his pocket. I didn't wait to see what it was. I hit him again, this time in the face, and he finally bolted, running out of the RV and into the woods. I locked the door behind him and sat there shaking, trying to process what just happened. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I drove straight to the nearest police station. They searched the woods near the campground, but came up empty. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. All I know is that I'm never camping alone again. This was back in October of last year. I live in Vallejo, California, and work a pretty standard office job. By the time fall rolled around, I was burnt out and needed a break from everything. I've always liked being outdoors. It helps me clear my head, so I decided to take a solo camping trip. Nothing crazy, just a couple of days in Stanislaus National Forest. I'd camped there a few times before, and it always felt safe. It's not the most popular spot, but that's part of why I liked it. I figured I'd have some peace and quiet, maybe do a little hiking, and head back feeling refreshed. I got there in the late afternoon on a Friday and found a nice spot near a creek. The first night was perfect. Just me, the sound of the water, and a small fire to keep me company. I cooked some hot dogs over the flames, watched the stars for a while, and turned in early. The second day was just as peaceful. I went for a long hike, took some photos of the fall leaves, and even saw a deer. I didn't see another person the whole day, which was exactly what I'd wanted. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was starting to set. That's when things started to get weird. I had just gotten my fire going and was sitting down to eat when I heard footsteps. At first I thought it was an animal, but then I saw someone step out from the trees. He was about my age, maybe mid-30s, with scruffy hair and a beard. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and he had a big hiking pack on his back. He looked harmless enough, but there was something about the way he walked, slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to startle me. "Hey there," he said, raising a hand in a friendly wave. "Mind if I join you for a bit? Been hiking all day and could use a rest." I hesitated. I'm not the most social person, especially with strangers, but I didn't want to be rude. I nodded and said, "Sure, no problem." He dropped his pack a few feet away and sat down across the fire from me. He pulled out a water bottle and took a long drink, then let out a deep sigh. "Thanks," he said. "Name's Brian, by the way." I told him my name, and we made small talk for a while. He seemed nice enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, or how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. After a while, he started telling me stories about the area. "Did you know this place used to be full of gold miners back in the 1800s?" he said, leaning forward. "They'd set up camps just like this, hoping to strike it rich, but a lot of them didn't make it out alive." "Really?" I said, trying to sound interested. "Yeah," he said, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Some died from accidents, others from the weather, but a lot of them, well, let's just say not everyone out here was friendly. You'd be surprised how many people went missing back then." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to laugh it off and change the subject, but he kept steering the conversation back to dark, unsettling topics. He talked about hikers who'd vanished without a trace, strange things people had seen in the woods, and how easy it would be for someone to disappear out here. By the time I realized how late it had gotten, I was feeling seriously uncomfortable. "I should probably get some sleep," I said, standing up. "Yeah, me too," he said, smiling. But he didn't leave. Instead, he got up, walked over to his pack, and pulled out a small tarp and sleeping bag. "You mind if I set up here for the night?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him no, but I didn't want to make him angry. So I nodded, and he started laying out his stuff a few feet from the fire. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there in the dark, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that he was just a tired hiker looking for a place to rest. But then I heard it, the soft, deliberate sound of a zipper. Not mine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, moving around the tent. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped, and I thought maybe he'd gone back to his sleeping bag. But then the tent started to move. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling. But then I saw the fabric shift, like someone was running their hand along the outside. "Brian?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I fumbled for the zipper, trying to open it without making too much noise. The moment I stepped out, the flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Brian was standing there, just a few feet away, holding a knife. I froze. My first instinct was to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The tent was behind me, the fire to the side, and Brian stood between me and the trees, his silhouette flickering in the firelight. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. "What's going on?" Brian didn't answer right away. He just stood there, turning the knife in his hand, the blade catching the light. Then he smiled, not the polite smile he'd given me earlier, but something colder, sharper. "You know," he said, his voice calm, "you really shouldn't camp out here alone. It's dangerous." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Look, man, if you're upset or something, we can talk this out. You don't need to." "To what?" he interrupted, stepping closer. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Please, I'll pack up and leave right now. You can have the campsite. I don't want any trouble." Brian tilted his head like he was considering it. Then he let out a low chuckle. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about the campsite." My stomach dropped. I glanced toward the trees, calculating how far I'd have to run to lose him. But he must have seen the look in my eyes because he shifted, blocking my path. "You think you can outrun me?" he asked, his tone almost amused. I didn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to think of something, anything, to get me out of this. The fire crackled between us, the only sound besides my own ragged breathing. Then, without thinking, I threw the flashlight at him. It wasn't a great throw, but it was enough to startle him. He flinched, and I used that moment to sprint toward the trees. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Behind me, I heard him yell, followed by the sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. The only thought in my head was to get as far away from him as possible. The forest was pitch black, and I was running blind, branches snagging at my clothes and tearing at my skin. I could hear him getting closer, his heavy breaths and the sharp snap of twigs under his boots. Then I tripped. I went down hard, the air knocked out of me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I could hear him coming, his footsteps slowing as he got closer. "You shouldn't have run," he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking so badly I could barely push myself up. My ankle throbbed where I'd twisted it in the fall, but I forced myself to keep going. Then I saw it, the faint outline of a trail marker up ahead. I didn't know where it led, but it didn't matter. I veered toward it, hoping it would take me closer to the road or a ranger station or anywhere with other people. Brian's footsteps were getting louder, his pace steady and unrelenting. I could feel him closing the distance, like a predator stalking its prey. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights. I stumbled into the middle of a dirt road just as a pickup truck came around the bend. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding to a stop a few feet from me. I turned, expecting to see Brian charging after me, but the woods behind me were empty. The driver jumped out of the truck, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I could barely speak. "There's someone, he's trying to..." But when I looked back toward the trees, there was no sign of Brian, no footsteps, no movement, nothing. The driver must have seen the panic on my face because he didn't ask any more questions. He just opened the passenger door and said, "Get in." I didn't argue. We drove to the nearest ranger station and I told them everything. They sent a couple of rangers back to my campsite, but by the time they got there, it was empty. No tarp, no sleeping bag, no footprints. It was like Brian had never been there at all. I haven't been camping since that night. I still think about it, though, about how close I came to disappearing, just like the people in his stories. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his next friendly campfire chat. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.